My name is Shauna Beulah, and I'm the branch manager of the library in St. Michael's. I have two books about Frederick Douglass that I would like to share with you. The first one is a picture book of Frederick Douglass by Samuel Bird. Frederick Douglass was born a slave on a tobacco, corn, and wheat farm in Talbot County, Maryland. He was born in February 1818. His mother named him Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. Frederick's mother was an African-American slave named Harriet Bailey. He never knew who his father was, but he did know that he was a white man. Some people said he was Captain Aaron Anthony, Frederick's first owner. Soon after Frederick was born, he was taken to live with his grandmother, Betsy Bailey. He only saw his mother 4 or 5 times after that. She had to walk 12 miles at night to see her son and walk 12 miles back to be at work by sunrise. If she was late, she would be whipped. He wrote later, "She would lie down with me and get me to sleep, but long before I waked, she was gone." She died when Frederick was about 7 years old. When Frederick was 6, he was taken to his master's house and put to work. He wrote later about how he lived as a slave. "In the hottest summer and the coldest winter, I was kept almost naked. No shoes, no stockings, no jacket, no trousers, nothing. Nothing on but a coarse tow lining shirt reaching only to my knees. He was fed boiled cornmeal called mush." Frederick was wakened often by the cries of a slave being beaten. The first time that happened, it was his own Aunt Hester who was tied to a hook and whipped. Young Frederick was so frightened that he ran into a closet and hid. When Frederick was 8 years old, he was taken to Baltimore to live as the slave of Sophia and Hugh Auld, relatives of his master's daughter. He ran errands for the Aulds and took care of their infant son, Thomas. Young Frederick Bailey was Sophia Auld's first slave. She was a good-hearted woman and taught Frederick the alphabet. She began to teach him to read until her husband told her it was against the law. Hugh Auld said a slave should know nothing but to obey his master. Sophia Auld stopped teaching Frederick, but he didn't stop learning. He took a book with him when he went out on errands. Poor white boys he met in the street helped him learn to read. When Frederick was about 12, he told the boys, "I am a slave for life," and he asked them, "Have not I a gooder right to be free as you have?" Frederick read the Bible and went to a church Sabbath school for black children. When he was 14, he taught at the school. In 1833, Frederick was sent to work for Thomas Auld, Hugh's brother. The next year, he was sent to work for Edward Covey, a poor farmer known to break the spirit of young slaves. Frederick worked hard. Even so, Covey beat him about once a week. Then one summer morning, Frederick fought back. Covey never beat him again. The fight was the turning point in Frederick's life as a slave. "I was nothing before," he said later. "I was a man now." On January 1st, 1835, Frederick was sent to work for William Freeland. On Sundays, the slaves had no work, and Frederick opened a secret Sabbath school and taught slaves to read. Frederick longed to be free. He and a few other slaves hoped to escape by boat, but someone told of their plans, and Frederick was put in jail. He expected to be sold to a slave owner in the deep South to work in the cotton fields, a fate Frederick thought of as a life of living death. But instead, he was sent back to Baltimore to be Hugh Auld's slave again. Frederick worked in a shipyard. Whatever he earned, he gave to Hugh Auld. In Baltimore, Frederick met many free African Americans, including Anna Murray. Together, they planned Frederick's escape from slavery. Frederick planned to travel north by train. Anna gave him the money he needed. A free African American sailor loaned Frederick papers to prove he was not a slave. Frederick rode 3 trains, 3 ferries, and a steamboat to New York City and freedom. Then, to make it difficult for slave catchers to find him, he changed his surname from Bailey to Johnson and then to Douglass. Soon after Frederick arrived in New York, he sent for Anna Murray. They were married on September 15, 1838, and moved further north to New Bedford, Massachusetts. Frederick and Anna Douglass had 5 children: Rosetta, Louis, Frederick Jr., Charles, and Anna. In New Bedford, Frederick worked loading and unloading ships, shoveling coal, and sweeping out chimneys. Frederick was pleased he didn't have to share his wages with a slave owner. About 4 months after he came to New Bedford, Frederick began reading The Liberator, an anti-slavery newspaper. He wrote later, "My soul was set all on fire." In 1841, Frederick Douglass met the editor of the newspaper, William Lord Garrison. Garrison hired him to travel to other cities, talk about the horrors of slavery, and to sell subscriptions to The Liberator. In 1845, his autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, was published. In the book, he wrote his original name, Frederick Bailey, and the name of his master. This put Frederick in danger of being caught as a runaway slave, so he went to England. He gave speeches there, too, about the evils of slavery. Frederick Douglass believed that people are not property to be owned by others. But still, in Baltimore, the Aulds held papers proving that they did own him. Some friends in England bought those papers and his freedom. Now he could go home. Frederick Douglass returned to the United States in 1847. He moved to Rochester, New York, and started his own anti-slavery newspaper, the North Star. Later it was renamed Frederick Douglass's paper. Frederick spoke out against the racial prejudice he found in the northern states. He spoke out for women's rights. His house became a stop on the Underground Railroad, a series of safe houses for runaway slaves on their way further north to freedom. On April 12, 1861, the 4-year-long Civil War between the Northern Union Army and the Southern Confederate Army began. It was the war that ended slavery in the United States. In 1863, Frederick Douglass helped gather soldiers for the first black unit in the Union Army. 3 of his sons joined. But Frederick Douglass soon learned that black soldiers were paid much less than whites and were given poor equipment and little training. He told this to President Lincoln. The president told Frederick Douglass to be patient. Progress in the rights of African Americans would come slowly. Eight months after the Confederate Army was defeated, the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution was passed. Slavery was outlawed. In 1864, Abraham Lincoln was re-elected president. In March 1865, after the inauguration, Frederick Douglass went to the White House to shake the president's hand. At first, he was not allowed in because he was African American. President Lincoln had him shown in, and as he entered the hall, the president said, "Here comes my friend, Douglass." Several weeks later, on April 14th, President Lincoln was shot. He died the next day. Frederick Douglass wrote 2 more books about his life. My Bondage and My Freedom, published in 1855, and The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, published in 1881. In 1877, he was named Marshal, and in 1881, Recorder of the Deeds for Washington, D.C. In 1889, he was named Consul General to Haiti. In 1882, Anna Douglass died. 2 years later, Frederick married Helen Pitts, a white woman. Both blacks and whites were upset by the marriage. Helen Pitts told people that she had married the man she loved. Frederick Douglass told people that his first wife was black, like his mother. His second wife was white, like his father. During his last years, Frederick Douglass spoke out against the mob violence and lynching of African Americans in the South. He wrote that every Southern breeze was tainted and frightened with Negro blood. Frederick Douglass had helped lead the struggle to end slavery. He had hoped to see blacks and whites throughout the United States living together in peace. He never did. On February 20, 1895, after attending a meeting on women's rights, Frederick had a heart attack and died. He was 77 years old. And the book also includes some dates about his life that were included in the story. So that was the first book. The second book I'd like to read is called Frederick Douglass, the Lion Who Wrote History. Both of these books are available at the library, at any library really, so if you'd like to borrow them, just go to the library and you can get them. So, Frederick Douglass, the Lion Who Wrote History. This is the story of how one man's careful decisions and many accomplishments not only made his own life better, but in many ways changed the history of America. Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey was born a slave in Talbot County, Maryland in 1818. His grandmother, Betsy Bailey, was also a slave, and she took care of young Frederick. When he was about 9, he was sent to live with slave owner Hugh All and his family. He was given chores to do around the house and helped care for the family's children. Soon after he arrived, Frederick saw Sophia All, the mistress of the house, teaching her children to read. He wanted to learn too. Seeing how eager he was, Mrs. Auld started giving him lessons along with her own children. But when Hugh Auld found out that his wife was teaching Frederick to read, he objected. Teaching a slave to read will make him unfit to be a slave, Mr. Auld said. Sophia was not happy, but she understood what her husband meant. The ability to read would expose slaves to ideas and information that would make them unhappy being owned by someone else. Frederick also understood what Mr. Auld was saying. He thought hard about how the slave owner linked reading with slavery. Frederick listened carefully to the Auld children. They spoke clearly and directly, and he knew that it was because they had also read the words they used. He felt that reading could make a difference in how a person lived. He grew up in the Auld household. Frederick was becoming aware of what it meant to be a slave. Slaves were forced to work for their owners. As punishment, they could be beaten and they could be sold away from their families. Frederick watched as the Auld children received an education. He listened as they excitedly shared their ideas and dreams with friends. Theirs sounded like a good life, and he wanted the same chance to build a good life for himself. If learning to read would make him unfit to be a slave, then that's what Frederick would do. He made the courageous decision to learn to read. It would be very difficult because slaves were not allowed to go to school or have books to practice reading. When he could, he borrowed books from the young white friends he sometimes played with. He picked up old newspapers and flyers he found in the streets, and anything that contained precious words was important to Frederick. By the time he was 16, Frederick was tall, well-built, and very unhappy with his life. He was also a reader and a young man who used words well. Sometimes he used them unwisely. After he argued with his master, he was sent to Edward Covey, a man known for making slaves less likely to stand up for themselves. He would bully the black men and women and beat them until they gave up the struggle to be more than slaves. Frederick was beaten viciously every week when he was with Covey. But one day, the slave breaker tried to beat him again, and he decided to fight back, even if it meant his death. The two men struggled furiously for more than half an hour. In the end, it was Covey who gave up against the now strong Frederick. Covey never tried to beat Frederick again. Frederick was hired out to the shipyards. He became a caulker, a hard job that took strong hands and careful attention as he put tar and heavy cord between the boards of ships to make them waterproof. Most of the money he earned went to his master, but for the first time, Frederick was meeting free black men. Many of them sailed the very ships he was repairing. Free black sailors had always been a problem for slaveholders. They had papers proving they were free and were able to walk around most ports as they chose. The tales of their adventures spread among the enslaved blacks. Frederick listened to them carefully and imagined himself being as free as they were. When he was 19, Frederick fell in love with a free black woman, Anna Murray, but he was a slave and could not be with her as he chose. The lure of freedom became almost unbearable, but to try to escape was a risky business. Slaveholders did not want to lose their precious property. When slaves who tried to escape were caught, they were often punished severely. Frederick knew he had to take the chance. In September 1838, Frederick made his move. Using the seaman's papers of a free black sailor and dressing like the sailors he saw on his job, he boarded a train headed north. "I suppose you have your papers?" the conductor asked him. "No, sir, I never carry any free papers to sea with me," Frederick said. "Here are my seaman's papers." The conductor looked at the papers. "You don't sound as if you are from around here," he said. "I haven't been around here much," Frederick said, holding his breath. The conductor gave Frederick a hard look and then accepted his fare. "I don't think you'd like it very much in these parts," he said. After the train ride, Frederick took a ferry across the Susquehanna River into Pennsylvania, and then he took another train to New York City. Frederick arrived at the home of an abolitionist whose name he had been given. "Sir, I can use some help." Frederick was almost trembling as he spoke to the man who answered the door. Come in, the man said. "You've come to the right place." Frederick entered the house and breathed a sigh of relief. He had escaped. Anna Murray soon joined him in New York, where they were married. After a short while, they made their home in New Bedford, Massachusetts. In 1838, New Bedford was a city with a small but strong black population. It was nicknamed the Whaling City because there were always whaleboats in the harbor, and Frederick was sure that he could find a job. Frederick loaded and unloaded ships, sawed wood, and hauled coal, anything to make a living. Afraid that slave catchers might be looking for him, Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey decided to rename himself. He was now Frederick Douglass. He was very impressed by the people he met in New Bedford. All of them were hard-working sailors or dock workers, and many of them were abolitionists who spoke passionately about the rights of all people. In turn, the abolitionists were impressed by Frederick. Here was a man who could actually tell people what it was like to be a slave. He had been forced to work for his white master. He had been beaten. His sisters had been sold away from their family. Not only could he tell of his experiences, but he could speak with an eloquence that stirred the souls of his audience. Douglass was often asked by the Abolitionist Society to speak at their meetings. Some people who heard him could hardly believe that he had ever been a slave. They wondered if all the black people working in the fields or on the southern plantations had the potential of this tall and handsome young man. Douglass was also asked to write the story of his life. In 1845, when he was only 27 years old, his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, was published. Frederick Douglass understood now how his speaking helped to bring people into the fight against the evils of slavery and for the equality of all human beings. In 1848, a convention for women's rights held in Seneca Falls, New York, his powerful speech convinced the male delegates to pass an important amendment demanding that women be allowed to vote. I have never yet been able to find one consideration, one argument or suggestion in favor of man's rights to participate in civil government which did not equally apply to the right of women, Douglass said. Frederick Douglass spent years speaking for the rights of black people and women. During those years, the differences between the agricultural South and with its cotton, rice, and other crops, and the more industrial North with its large cities and factories grew more distinct. In 1859, Frederick Douglass was contacted by John Brown, a militant white abolitionist. John Brown was passionate about freedom. He had heard the language of other abolitionists and saw that for the most part, slaveholders paid no attention to them. These men are all talk, he said. What we need is action. Action. In Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, Brown shared his plan with Frederick Douglass. It was risky, but to John Brown it was a lot more plausible than the do-nothing plans of other abolitionists. If Frederick Douglass would be a part of his plan, there would be a great chance of its working. Here is a chance to put the question to everyone that has been held a slave and to this country, Brown said to Douglass when they met. Douglass thought hard and carefully. Brown's plan was to capture the federal arsenal at Harpers Ferry, then take the weapons into the hills. To me, you are entering a perfect steel trap, Frederick Douglass said, and one from which you will not get out of alive. Shortly after their meeting, John Brown led the raid on the arsenal at Harpers Ferry on October 16, 1859. The raiders succeeded in capturing part of the grounds of Harpers Ferry and taking a number of hostages. But in the end, the raid failed as Douglass thought it would. The conflict between the northern and southern states came to a head in December 1860, when the southern states began to secede from the Union. They decided to form their own country, the Confederate States of America. President Abraham Lincoln ordered American forces called the Union Army to put down what he considered simple rebellion and treason. The battles between the North and the South went on for 3 long and bloody years, without either side gaining a decisive advantage. The Union Army was made up of white soldiers, with some blacks used as laborers. Douglass urged the Union to enlist black soldiers. In 1863, shortly after the Battle of Gettysburg, he met with President Lincoln and urged the president to enlist black soldiers as equals in the Union Army. I saw in this war the end of slavery, Douglass declared. I urged every man of color who could to enlist, to get an eagle on his button, a musket on his shoulder, and the star-spangled banner over his head. The iron gate of our prison stands half open. One gallant rush from the North will fling it wide open. while 4 million of our brothers and sisters shall march out into liberty. 180,000 black soldiers, many of whom had been born in slavery, joined the Union Army. They helped to defeat the Confederacy in 1865. In 1865, the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution was enacted to legally end slavery in the United States. The careful and wise decisions made by Frederick Douglass to learn to read, to escape from slavery, to speak out for justice for all Americans, and to aid the Union Army had helped to write American history. Frederick Douglass, born a slave, continued to work and speak for the rights of all Americans. He urged the United States government in Washington, as well as in Haiti, as Consul General. His voice, born in the soft tones of the slave population, truly became a lion's roar. And again, another timeline of Frederick Douglass's life that the book spoke about. So there we go.